The cart came at dawn, as it always did, and Susanna Prescott followed it the way she followed every cart that carried the dead away from Kelsbourne Hall, at a distance too great to be noticed and too near to be left behind. She had buried 3 men that winter without weeping once, and she did not intend to begin with a stranger. The horse was old, and its harness patched with wire, and the wheels left twin black lines through the frost, like a signature no one would ever be asked to read. She walked with her shawl pulled to her chin and her basket on her arm, empty, because an empty basket gave a woman reason to be anywhere, and reason was the only currency she had left. She was 23, though the parish register would have called her older on account of the hands. Hands aged faster than faces in her trade. Hers were reddened at the knuckle and precise at the fingertip, and they had set more bones and staunched more wounds than half the physicians who signed their names to the county's death certificates and never once touched the dying. No one in Fenmore village called her a surgeon's assistant. They called her the charwoman who came with the doctor's bag, because a woman's hands were permitted to scrub a floor and forbidden, by every unwritten law of the parish, to hold a lancet. She had learned to let them believe what was convenient. It cost her nothing but her name. The cart turned at the crossroads toward the surgeon's door, and Susanna understood, with the particular coldness of a woman who has learned to read carts the way other women read letters, that this death was not like the others. The horse did not plod. It was driven hard, foam at the bit, and the man on the box wore the Kelsbourne livery, grey and silver, the colours of the Duke's own household. She had followed a great many carts in her life. She had never followed one that belonged to a duke. Kelsbourne Hall sat above the village the way a held breath sits above a held tongue, visible from nearly every window in Fenmore, and spoken of by nearly no one who valued their position. The Duke himself she had glimpsed exactly twice in the whole of her 6 years in that parish, once at a distance, riding the cliff road at a punishing gallop that struck her, even then, as the pace of a man outrunning something no horse could actually catch, and once not at all, only his carriage, curtains drawn, passing her on the lane while she carried a basket of clean linen to a berthing 3 miles distant. She had formed, from those 2 sightings, and the gossip that filled the gaps between them, the same opinion of him that the rest of the parish held, without troubling to examine it. That he was cold, that he was proud, that he had buried whatever warmth he might once have possessed alongside his father, and that Kelsbourne's tenants were fortunate mainly in that his coldness was, at the least, not cruelty. She had not expected to have occasion to revise that opinion from quite so intimate a distance, nor so soon. It stopped before the surgeon's door with a jolt that rattled something loose in the back, and it was that sound, small, wet, wrong, that told her the passenger was not yet entirely gone. The surgeon Hollis, was 3 days abed with a fever of his own, and unlikely to rise before nightfall, and there was no one else within 2 miles who might touch a dying man and know what her hands were doing. Susanna set down her basket in the frozen mud and walked to the cart as though she had been sent for, because in every way that mattered to her, she had. She was not permitted, by the law of that place, to introduce herself as anything at all. She was permitted, by a law far older and far less written, to save a life, if she found one worth saving. Inside the cart lay a man in a greatcoat the colour of wet slate, and blood at his temple gone the deep brown of old varnish. And when she pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw, she found, beneath the stillness the driver had been so certain of, a pulse, faint, uneven, but present, ticking on like a clock no one had thought to wind. "He is not dead," she said, to no one, because the driver had already turned away to be sick against the wheel. She had 4 minutes, perhaps 5, before the cold finished what the fall had begun, and she used every one of them, without asking permission of a single soul. By the time the surgeon, Hollis's boy, came running with brandy and blankets, and a question forming on his lips that began with, "Who are you to touch him?" Susanna had already staunched the wound with her own petticoat, turned the man's head to clear his airway, and begun the low, steady counting under her breath that she used for every patient whose breath she did not entirely trust to continue on its own. "Fetch the surgeon's needle and the black thread from the second drawer," she said, without looking up. "And do not ask me again who I am, until the gentleman is warm." The boy fetched them. It was, in later tellings, and there would be later tellings, though not for some months yet, the first order Susanna Prescott had ever given in Fenmore that was obeyed without question. And she would remember it, oddly, more clearly than the stitching itself. The wound at his temple was deep, but clean. The kind of fall against rock leaves, rather than the kind of fall against soft ground leaves. And she noted that fact, the way she noted everything. Filed, not spoken. Kept for later use. She threaded the needle by window light, because the household had not yet thought to bring a lamp, and her hands did not shake, though the cold in that unheated room was fierce enough to whiten her knuckles further than the trade already had. She spoke to him as she worked, though he could not hear her, because it was a habit she had never broken since her father first taught her the trade. A low, steady patter meant less for the patient than for her own hands, to keep them honest and unhurried. "You will not die on a cottage floor," she told him, threading the last stitch. "Not after surviving whatever put you on that road. I have buried men with less reason to live than you appear to have, and I did not save my last hour of daylight for a man who means to waste it." It was, she would later admit to no one, rather more conversation than she generally afforded a stranger, dead or otherwise. She did not know, as she worked, that the man beneath her hands was Gideon Fairfax, 9th Duke of Kelsbourne, master of the hall whose lands ran to every hedge she had ever walked past on her way to somewhere she was not meant to be. She would not have worked with more care had she known it. She would only, perhaps, have worked with more fear, and fear was a luxury she had long since stopped affording herself. What she knew, when the stitching was done and the fever broken by midday, was only this: that he had been thrown from a horse on the cliff road above the cove, that the fall should by every reasonable account have killed him outright, and that whoever had found him and pronounced him dead upon the road had not troubled to check a pulse before summoning the cart. That last fact troubled her more than the fall. A man does not simply fail to be checked on a duke's own land by a duke's own people, unless someone very much wished the checking to be brief. She thought of that even as she worked, in the cold, careful part of her mind that never entirely stopped calculating, the part that had kept her fed and housed and quietly employed in a trade no woman was meant to practice for 6 years running. She filed the thought away, the way she filed every dangerous thing she noticed and could not yet afford to say aloud, and she went on stitching, because the man's life came first, and her suspicions could wait. He woke 3 days later to a room he did not recognize, and a woman he recognized even less, seated at his bedside with her sleeves rolled and a ledger of some kind open on her knee. And his first coherent thought, before pain or confusion or even his own name, was that she had extraordinarily steady hands for a woman pretending to be afraid of him. "You are awake," she said, without startlement, without the trembling curtsy the situation seemed to demand. "That is good. I had begun to suspect you meant to prove me wrong." "Wrong about what?" he said, or attempted to say. His voice came out as gravel dragged over stone. "That you would live," she said. There was a period of some hours in which the wager did not favor you. It was, he would later reflect, the least deferential sentence any person had spoken to him since his father's funeral, and he found, to his own considerable surprise, lying broken and useless beneath a ceiling he did not recognize, that he did not mind it in the slightest. He was, before the fall, a man widely regarded by the ton as unmoved by nearly everything, and the regard was not unearned. He had inherited Kelsbourne at 24 upon his father's death, and inherited, along with it, a decade of flattery so relentless and so plainly mercenary that he had long since stopped believing any word spoken to him by a person who stood to gain from his good opinion, which was, by his own count, very nearly everyone he had ever met in London. He had come to Cornwall the previous autumn to escape a season of women who admired his income with a warmth they could not quite counterfeit for his person, and he had found, in the cold Cornish air and the sound of the sea against the cliffs, something closer to peace than he had known since boyhood. He had also found, though he did not yet know it, a woman who had never once flattered him, on account of not knowing, for the first 4 days of his convalescence, precisely who he was. "You may call me Prescott," she told him, on the second morning, when he asked, with the particular imperiousness of a man unused to being denied an answer. "It is the only name that concerns the physic." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one you shall have from me at present, Your Grace, and I would ask that you save your strength for breathing rather than interrogation." She had learned his rank from the boy by then, and had decided, with the same cold calculation that governed every other choice she made, that the less he knew of her, the safer she remained. And safety, for a woman practicing medicine without a license or a name to protect her, was worth a great deal more than his good opinion. He did not press her again that day. He watched her, instead, with the particular attention of a man who has spent a decade learning to detect falseness in every smile turned toward him, and found, to his own quiet alarm, that he could detect none in hers. Because she was not, in point of fact, smiling at him at all. She was occupied entirely with the business of keeping him alive, and it had not yet occurred to her that this made her remarkable. It was this, more than her steadiness or her skill, that began, slowly, and against every instinct he had cultivated for a decade, to thaw something in him that had been frozen since long before the fall. She came each morning at 7, and did not leave until the light failed. And in the space of those long, quiet hours, he came to know a great deal about Miss Prescott, without her ever once volunteering it directly. He learned that she took her tea without sugar, because sugar was a luxury she had trained herself out of wanting some years before. He learned that she read while he slept, not novels, but a battered anatomical text with a spine cracked from use, and that she made small notations in its margins, in a hand too neat to belong to a woman who had never been properly taught her letters. He learned that she flinched, very slightly, whenever he called her Miss Prescott in front of the household staff, and that the flinch vanished entirely when he called her nothing at all, only Prescott, as though the shortened form were a private agreement between the two of them that no one else in the room was privy to. He began, without entirely meaning to look forward to 7 o'clock. "You are staring, Your Grace," she told him on the 9th morning, not looking up from the ledger on her knee. "I am observing," he said. "A physician's habit, I am told, though I confess I have only recently acquired it." "You have acquired it from me, then, and I would ask that you practice it on someone less occupied with your stitches." "I find," he said, "that I have very little interest in observing anyone else at present." She did look up then, and something passed between them that neither chose to name, and she returned to the ledger with rather more attention than the figures strictly required. The wager, when he finally understood it, was uglier than either of them had first supposed. Susanna pieced it together over the following fortnight, in the careful, patient manner she pieced together every diagnosis. A symptom here, an oddity there, until the shape beneath the surface became impossible to mistake for anything but what it was. The Duke's cousin, Simon Halloway, stood to inherit Kelsbourne entire should his Grace die without issue, and his Grace, at 31 and unmarried, was a standing invitation to exactly the sort of accident that had very nearly succeeded on the Cliff Road. But it was not Halloway's hand Susanna found at the centre of it, when the centre finally came clear. It was a woman's. Lady Cordelia Ashworth, the wager's true architect, who had made a private bet with 2 other ladies of fortune before the season's end that she would be the Duchess of Kelsbourne by Michaelmas, whatever the cost of securing him. She had courted him for a 12-month with a warmth he had long suspected was rehearsed, and when he had shown no sign of proposing, she had turned, quietly, methodically, with the same cold arithmetic Susanna herself might have admired in a better cause, towards securing him by other means. A frightened man, freshly widowed of his own bachelorhood by a near-fatal fall, might be persuaded toward marriage by a woman positioned, conveniently, as his rescuer and comfort in the aftermath. It had not occurred to Lady Cordelia that the fall might also fail to kill him, or that the true rescue would be performed already, and performed better, by a woman she had never once troubled to notice existed. Susanna first heard the name Ashworth from the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, who mentioned it in passing while restocking the sick room's linens, in the manner of a woman repeating gossip she does not fully credit, but cannot resist repeating regardless.
"Lady Cordelia has written thrice this week already,"
Mrs. Fenwick said,
"asking after his Grace's recovery in a hand so pressed into the paper you'd think she meant to wound the desk along with him."
Susanna said nothing to that, though she noted it, filed it beside the unchecked pulse and the too hard-driven cart-horse, and began, in the quiet hours when the Duke slept, to consider what shape of woman wrote 3 letters in a week to a man she had not troubled to visit even once. The answer, when it arrived in the form of Lady Cordelia's carriage a full 10 days after the fall, a delay Susanna found instructive in itself, for a woman claiming devotion rarely waited 10 days to display it, confirmed everything the letters had already suggested. "She means to call upon you within the week," Susanna told him, laying the last of the pieces before him, with the same steady hands she used for every difficult truth. "She will express her relief at your survival with a great deal of feeling, and she will not ask, even once, how you came to survive at all. I would watch, Your Grace, for what a person does not ask." He watched. Susanna was, as in nearly every matter she had turned her mind to since his waking, entirely correct. He said nothing of what he suspected to Susanna in that hour, because the wound in his pride ran deeper than the one on his skull, and pride, in a man raised from childhood to distrust, nearly every warmth turned toward him, is the slowest wound of all to admit to. But he watched Lady Cordelia arrive 3 days later in a carriage entirely too fine for a country sick-room visit, watched her weep with a precision that struck him, for the first time in a decade of courtship, as rehearsed rather than felt, and watched her ask after his comfort, his appetite, his spirits, and never once, in the better part of an hour, after the manner of his fall. He asked her himself, at the last, with the flat and terrible calm of a man who has finally seen the shape of the thing he has been refusing to see for a 12-month. She did not have an answer ready. It was the only honest moment she gave him in the whole of their acquaintance, and it was enough. Susanna, meanwhile, went on tending him with the same unornamented competence she had brought to every patient in 6 years of practicing a trade that did not officially exist. And if she noticed that the Duke's eyes, warm brown, she had catalogued early on, without permitting herself to dwell on the observation, followed her rather more than his convalescence strictly required, she did not remark upon it, because remarking upon it was a luxury a nameless woman in his household could not afford. It was the ledger that undid her disguise in the end, and not any careless word. Halloway, growing desperate as the wages collapse drew nearer and his own inheritance further, attempted, clumsily and in the dead of night, to alter the household accounts to suggest a theft that might be laid at the charwoman's door and used to have her turned out before she could say anything further to anyone of consequence. She discovered the alteration by accident, or by the sort of accident that only befalls a woman in the habit of checking every figure twice. She had gone to the household ledger to note the cost of a fresh supply of carbolic, only to find an entry 3 pages prior, in a hand not her own, recording a sum of silver plate reported missing from the Duke's own study. Plate that Susanna, who had dusted that study herself not 2 days before, on an evening when the regular maid was ill, knew for a certainty had never left its case. She sat with that knowledge for the better part of an hour before she acted upon it, turning it over the way she turned over every diagnosis that frightened her, because she understood precisely what such an entry was built to accomplish. A theft discovered would end with a woman turned out before nightfall, and no magistrate in the county inclined to hear a nameless charwoman's protest against a Duke's own cousin. She had seen women ruined on thinner evidence than that. He had not accounted for the fact that Susanna kept her own ledger, in her own hand, of every dose and every hour, with a precision that made his forgery immediately, laughably apparent to the one person in the house capable of reading figures with a physician's eye. She brought both ledgers to the Duke herself, at midnight, still in her apron, because she had decided, in the same instant she had decided to save his life on the surgeon's doorstep, that some truths could not wait for daylight to be convenient. "Your cousin," she said, laying the pages before him without preamble, "has attempted to make a thief of me, in order to remove me from this house before I say something he cannot afford said. You should know that I am not, in fact, a thief.
You should also know that I am not, in fact, a charwoman, though I have allowed the household to believe it for reasons that were, until this hour, entirely my own to keep." "Then what are you?" he said, not as accusation, but as a man asking, at last, the question he ought to have asked a fortnight prior. "I am the daughter of a naval surgeon who taught me his trade because he had no son to teach it to, and who died owing more than he left, which is how I came to Fenmore with nothing but his instruments and no license any court in England would recognize as belonging to a woman," she said. "I have set bones and delivered children and closed wounds that would otherwise have closed a great many families in grief. And I have done it under a false name, because the true one would have ended the work before it began. I saved your life on the surgeon's doorstep because you were dying, and I had the skill to prevent it, not because I knew or cared whose life it was. I would ask that you weigh my honesty about this now against whatever falsehood my silence may have cost you." He was silent long enough that she began, despite herself, to prepare for the sentence she had always known this moment might carry. Dismissal. Disgrace. The ruin of the only trade she had ever been permitted to practice. He might have doubted her still, had she not, 3 days prior, done a thing she had not told him of at all. A tenant's boy on the far edge of the estate had taken a fever the physicians of Fenmore pronounced hopeless, and Susanna had gone to him at midnight, on foot, unasked and unpaid, and sat with him until dawn, using methods no licensed physician in the county would have troubled to attempt on a family too poor to matter to anyone's reputation. She had told no one at Kelsbourne where she had gone, because the going cost her a night's sleep she could ill afford, and asked nothing in return. And it was only when the boy's mother arrived at the hall's kitchen door, with a basket of the only eggs her family could spare, asking after the woman who had saved her son, that the household learned of it at all. The Duke heard the story second-hand from Mrs. Fenwick, who told it with the particular relish of a woman who has found, at last, gossip worth repeating for the right reasons. He said nothing of it to Susanna directly, but he thought of it, turning it over the way she turned over her diagnoses, and understood that a woman who spent her exhaustion on a tenant's child who could offer her nothing had very little use for the kind of calculation Lady Cordelia practiced so fluently. "You saved my life," he said at last, "and told me nothing but the truth about every matter that concerned my survival, for a fortnight, while a woman who has courted me for a year could not manage a single honest hour in the whole of one afternoon. I find, Miss Prescott, that I am considerably less troubled by the name you withheld than by the name I nearly gave to someone else entirely." It was not yet a declaration. He was not, by nature or by wound, a man who arrived at tenderness quickly, and Susanna, who had learned, across 6 years of a trade that punished every soft assumption, never to mistake relief for resolution, did not permit herself to hope for one. But he asked, before she left the room that night, that she remain at Kelsbourne under her own name, in whatever capacity the parish's narrow laws might permit. And he asked it not as a lord commanding a servant, but as a man asking a favour of the one person who had never once lied to him. The reckoning, when it came at Michaelmas, precisely as Lady Cordelia's wager had specified, though not in the manner she had gambled on. The Duke called a gathering of the county's principal families, ostensibly to mark his full recovery, and used the occasion instead to lay before them, in the same flat and terrible calm he had once turned upon Lady Cordelia in the sick-room, the whole architecture of the wager and the forged ledger both, with Halloway's own hand upon the second page, for any magistrate to examine at his leisure. The room that evening was lit by more candles than Susanna had seen gathered in one place in the whole of her 6 years in Fenmore, and she stood near the back of it, still in the plain grey she preferred, while the county's finest families murmured over sherry and waited to be told why they had been summoned. She had not wanted to attend at all. The Duke had asked her once, plainly, and had not asked a second time when she hesitated, only told her that the truth would be spoken, whether or not she stood to hear it, and that he would rather she heard it from him than from the parish afterward, twisted 3 ways by repetition. She watched Lady Cordelia's face when the ledger was produced, watched the practiced composure hold for the first several sentences, and then, as the Duke's account grew more precise, more damning, more plainly beyond dispute, watched it fail entirely, the way ice fails on a pond too long trusted to bear weight it was never suited to hold.
Holloway left the county within the fortnight. His inheritance and his reputation both forfeit. Lady Cordelia's wager, once the whole of the county understood its terms, cost her rather more than the season she had spent securing it. For a woman who had gambled her honor on becoming a duchess, found very little sympathy from a ton that valued, above nearly everything else, not being made a fool of publicly. Susanna wanted no part of the reckoning spectacle. She had asked only, when the Duke pressed her on what she wished for herself, that her father's instruments be recognized as her own, and her practice permitted to continue under her true name, whatever the parish's unwritten laws might mutter about it. He gave her a great deal more than that, in time, though he was careful, in the manner of a man who had learned tenderness late and meant to earn it properly, not to give it all at once. He restored to her, first, the standing her father's name had once carried in the county, before debt had erased it, quietly settling the old accounts that had driven her father, Physician Prescott, to his grave still owing, so that the name Prescott might be spoken again in Fenmore without the shame that had followed it for a decade. He restored, second, her right to practice, securing, through channels no charwoman could ever have reached alone, a physician's license granted under her own name, the first such license in the county ever issued to a woman, and one that would outlast every wager and every duke who had ever tried to claim credit for it. It was not granted easily, nor swiftly. The county's licensing board sat twice on the matter, and twice found reasons to delay. And it was only when the Duke himself appeared before them a third time, not as a petitioner, but as a landholder, reminding the board precisely whose good opinion their own appointments depended upon, that the matter was settled in an afternoon that might otherwise have stretched to another year of postponement. Susanna, told of this only after the fact, was not certain whether to be grateful or affronted that her worth had required a duke's leverage to be recognized by men who had examined her competence directly and found no fault in it whatsoever, only in her sex. She settled, in the end, on gratitude tempered by the private resolve that the next woman to seek such a license would not require a duke's intervention to secure it, and she spent no small part of her following years ensuring precisely that. And he restored, last and most quietly, on an evening in early winter, with the sea loud against the Cornish cliffs and the sandalwood and ledger ink smell of his study settled comfortably around them both. Whatever it was in himself that a decade of mercenary smiles had worn thin and cold. "I did not fall in love with you for saving my life," he told her, in the plain, unornamented voice he had learned, at some point in that long fortnight, was the only voice she ever fully trusted. "I fell in love with you for the fortnight afterward, in which you never once told me what I wished to hear, instead of what was true." "That is a low bar for affection, Your Grace," she said, though her voice, for the first time in 6 years of guarding it carefully, was not entirely steady. "Most people manage to clear it by simply not lying to begin with." "Most people," he agreed, "are not you." She married him the following spring, under her own name, with her father's instruments displayed in the hall, as though they were a duke's own heirlooms, which, in every sense that mattered to either of them, they had become. She did not give up the practice for the title, though every woman of her new rank assured her, with varying degrees of tact, that she might now be excused from it. She kept a surgery in the village still, 3 mornings a week, and treated tenant and gentry alike with the same unornamented competence she had once spent on a dying stranger in a cart. And if the ton found it an eccentricity unbecoming a duchess, the Duke found it the truest reason he had ever had to be proud of the name he had given her. The county remembered it, in later years, as the tale of the Duke who married beneath his station, and thereby married a great deal higher than he had ever managed with a countess's daughter, the surgeon's daughter, the charwoman who was not, the woman who had followed a cart she had no reason to follow, and found, at the end of it, a life she had never once dared to wager on. There are marriages made for a title, and there are marriages made for an inheritance, and there are marriages made, rarer than either, and worth a great deal more, for the simple, unfashionable fact of a truth spoken plainly when a lie would have been so very much easier. Theirs, whatever the county chose to call it afterward, was the last kind.
And when their daughter was born, some years on, and grew old enough to ask why the surgery at Kelsbourne bore her mother's name rather than her father's title, the Duke would only say that some debts are paid in coin, and some in license, and some, the truest kind, are paid simply in being believed, at last, by the one person whose belief had never once been for sale. Their daughter grew up believing, as a matter of plain household fact, that a woman's hands might hold the lancet as rightfully as they might hold the title, and she was never once made to unlearn it. It was, of everything the Duke restored that winter and the spring that followed, the inheritance he was proudest to have secured. Not the license, not the settled debts, not even the name spoken again without shame in Fenmore, but the quiet certainty, passed down entire to a child who had not been there to see it won, that a truth spoken plainly would always, in the end, outlast whatever lie had been built to bury it.